Welcome everyone to Rebel Impact for another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Rebel Gray, and today we're going to talk about the impact that the Legacies set has had on the meta and the game in general. And just to preface this whole conversation, it has in fact had a huge impact. So what I want to do in this presentation is go over some of the things that the designers put into Legacies that have both changed how we view the game and has changed the direction of the game as it heads into the future. We'll talk about some specific card comparisons as we go through this to highlight these changes, but mostly, as we always do, we're going to talk about concept and theory. Also, as we go through this, I'm going to talk a lot about the trilogies format as Legacies established a new block of play, which is worth discussing. Alright, so sit back and soak it in, folks. You might be hearing my air conditioner in the background. I hope that's not too annoying. And there's a little dog running around here who may make a cameo for the second or third time. I apologize for that ahead of time, unless you're a dog lover, in which case, awesome, maybe you'll hit the subscribe button. That said, don't go anywhere. I'm going to be right back. Probably the most obvious contribution of Legacy set is how it establishes a new block. Now, FFG being FFG, they actually release products belonging to this block prior to the release of the base set. And I'm talking, of course, about the two-player game, which people say that you can find at Target now for like $8 or something like that. But when Legacies proper came out, it marked a division in the game's life. For the first time, we could separate new stuff from old stuff within constructed formats. And the trilogies format, as FFG calls it, is all products from the newest release cycle. So at the time of this video, pretty much everyone's referring to that as all the white box products that you're going to see on the shelves at your local game store. And what this meant for the game was rather significant. You know, it allowed the designers to set a new tone and pace for the game, throw in some new mechanics, which we're going to talk about later in some context, and essentially wall off any old cards that they didn't want as part of that new constructed format. Having card blocks, of course, is essential for game designers to rotate out old stuff and bring in new stuff to see how it works. So essentially they actually learn a lot from watching blocks unfold in a wild and seeing what's overpowered or underpowered so that they can use that knowledge to enhance balance over time. Likewise, players learn a lot from developers because new cards show us how the game's designers think in a way. And there are certainly implications that can be drawn from looking at a card's cost and effect, seeing how a similar effect's cost changes over the course of the game's life, things like that. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about this later as far as the theory stuff goes. A new block is also really important because it allows new players to jump into this game without fear of being out of the loop. If you didn't buy in early or during the last cycle, you don't have to worry about that. We've got a format just for you. And since even the older players want to have these new cards for the standard base game, you'll always have a player base for trilogies and trilogies in that new block, in theory anyway. Trilogies format itself really, though, hasn't been supported on the larger stage as many competitive players would hope. There have been tournaments, at the Galactic qualifiers, but nothing significant or on the level of even a store championship has been announced. And it doesn't seem like there's really a plan to push trilogies as anything other than a casual format now. You know, and that's some people think that's kind of sad. I mean, I do too. And I feel like FFG is really missing the boat by excluding trilogies from these big events, or rather that they're just not shining enough of a spotlight on it right now. And I'm hopeful that perhaps that will change in the near future. Next up, let's talk about Legacy's impact on the design of the game. And the next three sections are going to focus on very meta stuff, and we're going to talk about specific examples in each one of these sections. And in this one, we're going to talk about the first and most noticeable change to the game, which is how they've tried to lengthen the game. And they've attempted to do this in a number of different ways, but the most obvious one, of course, is the introduction of indirect damage, the intended effect of which is to allow your opponent to assign damage, thus lengthening the lifespan of their individual characters and their overall team just a little bit. This was sort of offset, however, by how they seem to have valued their dice. Now, for all intents and purposes, we're going to take a look at the modified Hawk 290 to illustrate this point. And this is where we're going to get some insights into how the team over there thinks about things, right? So the Hawk, which I'm going to refer to it as, is a 2-cost vehicle, and for this die, which is stunning, there are things we can talk about. Now, there's a downside to this vehicle, however, of course, which is built into its cost, which players have learned to deal with in different ways, and we're not going to get into that. But in any case, what we want to look at here are the damage sides themselves, specifically the ones that are free and the ones that cost 1 resource, okay? If we can establish for a moment in a vacuum that any die on the same resolvable type, damage, resource, whatever, that costs the same amount of resources as any other side on the same die, and we can say that those are equivalent, then we can conclude 2 things here, okay? The first is that FFG considers the 2 range damage side and the 3 indirect damage side on this die as equivalent. The second is that FFG considers the 3 range damage for $1 and the 4 indirect damage for $1 also as equivalent. Now, if you think it through, you can't really extend this concept to every card in the game, right? If you look at something like Chance Cube, you would never say, well, FFG must think that the 1 resource side and the 3 resource sides are equivalent. But anyway, the sides that both cost the same resource, 1 resource in this case, on the Hawk, make a strong case for this equivalency, right? If they're making you pay the same amount for something, you might think, well, then they must be equivalent effect, right? So what that means is they really do think 3 direct range damage is equivalent to 4 indirect damage, right? Remember, we're talking about something on the same die here, okay? All right, so leaving the Hawk example behind just because I had to use that to illustrate the point for a minute. Indirect damage doesn't necessarily have the effect of lengthening the game as FFG may have intended it to, because indirect damage equivalencies aren't actually the same value on the die. Indirect always seems to be 1 more damage, right? For whatever reason. Instead, what it does do is extend individual characters' health bars very slightly, and it also alleviates a lot of the pressure that direct damage does do. So in that sense, it's like this weird balancing act where you're taking more damage, but you get to decide where it goes as the opponent. It kind of lengthens the game, but we haven't really seen that in practice. Games seem to be going 3 to 4 rounds anyway. Sometimes they hit 5. It's been kind of the same in high level standard play. We haven't really seen it be, too off the charts. The second effect of the indirect damage that I would say that is really common within a Legacies block is that mixed damage exists on the same die. So we've got some direct damage stuff and some indirect damage stuff, right? And you saw that with the Hawk 290. And, this part of the design probably has a greater effect on the pace of the game than the previous one. If you've ever played a deck that's just all indirect damage, for example, you've seen firsthand how fast those extra 1 to 2 damage per die resolution do add up. So even if you do have the choice of where they go, you're still dealing more damage than you would have in a direct damage deck, right? In a deck with really mixed damage types, though, you're taking more actions in a round, thus slowing down the overall game somewhat. But you're not actually impacting the number of rounds. You're actually increasing the amount of actions in a round. So, again, it's this weird give and take balance sort of thing about trying to lengthen the game. And I'm not sure that it has exactly the intended effect that FFG was really going for. Another aspect that we could consider that extends the game are when characters have better value in a set. Now, I've observed, as I'm sure many others have, that the hit points for characters in this game have been creeping up very, very slightly. Now, we mostly notice this on characters that see regular play rather than just looking at sets as a whole, but that's actually what I've done here. So let's take a look at this chart for a few moments here. And what I've done to get these numbers is I took the average point cost and the average hit point cost of all characters in a given set, and I divided them by each other. Then I placed them on a card. Anytime a unique character has an elite version, which they all do, I just took the base point value here. And the idea here is that FFG values point costs per hit points better over the course of time. Now, obviously, we cannot control for a few things here, however, like characters' abilities. We can only assume that abilities of unique characters are probably better than non-unique character abilities, and since uniques tend to be worth more points than non-uniques, that somehow arbitrarily balances itself out in some way in the math and somewhere. I know that's like a mouthful. But in any case, what we're most interested in here is the value of the legacy set, which is the number all the way to the right here, right? And it's the highest one. It has the best points to hit point ratio of any set to date, and it's been trending like that since the last set. Now, the SOR outlier here probably has a lot to do with some really crappy non-unique characters like Jedi Alkaloid, Outer Rim Smuggler, and some oddly costed uniques for their hit points like Asajj and Mon Mothma. Keep in mind also that data can be misleading when you look at it. I want you to understand that this graph is in increments of 0.25, okay? So we're not talking about huge leaps as the scale of the actual graph would suggest, but it is enough to posit that sooner or later, sets are going to have point to HP ratios on their characters of better than 1. Now, the characters that we've seen up to this point with those particular ratios of 1 or better tend to be valued pretty well, okay? Here's a few of those. Balatik, Guavian Enforcer, FF2199 pre-nerf, Maz Kanata, Captain Phasma pre-nerf, Ayla Sakura right now, Jedha Partisan, Mother Talzin, and Yoda. All of these characters, at their base point values, have a point to hit point ratio of 1 or better. Fancy that. So the impact here is that we can say Legacies continue to trend of having characters of better value than any previous set, establishing the block both as a great standalone product for the new trilogies format that it created upon its release, while also throwing a bunch of new high-value characters into the mix for standard. The last thing I want to touch upon as a big game design impact factor was the fact that there is far less action cheating in the set than there was in Awakenings, which was the last base set. First and foremost, we don't have a character like Rey in this set, so all those extra actions that you were generating by simply dropping force speeds and chance cubes and whatever else on Rey, all that stuff is gone in a format like Trilogies. And that's awesome. You know, some might say that this block, as a result of that, is a real return to basics in a lot of ways. And you know, there's still a lot of good ambush cards in the set, though. Like, in fact, there are 10 ambush cards in Legacies as opposed to only 7 in Awakenings. And the difference is that the Awakenings ambush cards tended to be more impactful and also have additional bonuses for the same cost or less cost. So let's take a look at some cards that we could probably directly compare from these sets. And that's the Holdout Blaster and the E11 Blaster. Now, they both cost 2. And they both have redeploy. The E11 is red only, and it has mixed damage on the die, okay, which we talked about before. The Holdout Blaster has ambush as well as redeploy. It's also gray and neutral, and therefore can go in way more decks. But it has a pay side, but it doesn't have mixed damage. One is clearly a better value over the course of a block than the other, but we've only been able to illustrate that and observe that with the Holdout Blaster at this moment. But once we have an entire block to compare it to, the E11 could very well be considered as somewhat of a better value than the Holdout Blaster, depending on what the next couple of sets give us, right? So it's hard to imagine that right now, due to our limited scope of knowledge of the upcoming sets and how good we know that Holdout Blaster actually is. So these sorts of comparisons are where we can highlight those power creep reset buttons, which is, you know, something that Legacies certainly hit and needed to in order to make the Trilogies format slower, more steady, predictable, you know, however you want to describe it, you know, essentially that return back to basics. So in any case, the action cheating in Legacies also is severely limited outside of ambush, which you really can't even say is action cheating so much as it's just a game mechanic, okay? Additional actions, they have a real cost now, and there are very few ways to both turn a die and resolve it at all at once anymore. You know, the block has encouraged the game to be more fair, methodical, and focus on that interaction between players and their opponent's dice and cards. Action cheating, as a result, takes more setup using Legacies cards, which is, understandable. And on the other hand, you've got cards like Three Steps Ahead, which once again give us insight into what FFG might value an additional action at. And I'd say it's probably about 1 resource per action based on this card offhand. But you have to consider other factors, right? Like the buy-in, you need to have 3 resources. And basically means, in trilogies, if you ever played it, means basically casting nothing else this turn. And also getting to take those actions in a row is part of the balancing of this card. And also factors of balance that, I'm sure, these are all factors of balance, which I'm sure that FFG has established. And what they've done in establishing that is a baseline with a card like this. And what they said is that when Red Villain gets to take 3 actions in a row, that costs 3 resources. So that gives us a little bit of an insight into how they're thinking future action cheating in this block may actually look like. And what it does is it has a very, very high cost right now. Next up, we're going to talk about card power. And we're going to look at some specifics on card design out of this set. And probably the first thing worth discussing is something that I covered in my video, Striking a Balance. And it's cards having more restrictive conditions. And in that video, I actually compared Isolations from Awakenings and Mislead from Legacies. So I'm going to put those up on the screen here for you. And basically, you can see that these are essentially the same card. They fill the same role. But the important distinction here is the value of the die you can actually remove for just 1 resource, right? So in the Awakenings block, you could play Isolation, and it hits a die of any value as long as you can spot a blue character. Mislead, however, removes a character die showing a value of 2 or less, okay? And that is considered a harder hit to the card, in my opinion anyway, than the alternate, which is spotting a blue character and being able to basically remove any value, right? That's better to me in decks where the big baddie is blue. If not, Mislead can fill a spot just fine, and Mislead is actually seeing a good deal of play for that exact reason, because you've got a lot of decks right now, things like OTK or whatever, or other decks that have a big blue card in it, like Talzin, where that character becomes like a big target. So in order to keep removal online, you play Mislead rather than Isolation, but you could absolutely play both of these. And what these cards are parallels, okay? But I'm going to take it a step further and show you a couple other card comparisons here, right? And the next one up here is Feel the Force, which is far more restricted in its effect than a card like Use the Force, okay? And again, we've got a card that doesn't have a spot requirement in the Legacy set, but does in the Awakening set. But the power level is significantly different here, right? So, Use the Force can turn any die, and Feel the Force can only turn a blue die to any side. Now, that's a bigger difference than the previous example, I think. Your target becomes significantly restricted depending on the matchup. Of course, Feel the Force functions just fine in a blue versus blue game, but let's face it, Use the Force is still way better because it can hit any colored die for the same cost. Now, neither of these cards really sees a lot of play, but, it's just, we're looking at parallels, right? So in addition to the parallels that we've seen in these cards and what they tell us about how FFG values these different effects balance-wise, we're also seeing another little something emerge from their thought process. And we've always known that gray cards cost a bit more because you can put them in decks of varied color. So I'm not sure how much we can glean from this comparison specifically, but here we go anyway. So for example, He Doesn't Like You is a 0-cost villain-only removal card, which allows me to basically remove my worst die to remove the opponent's best die. And it can be any die removed on either side of the table. The newest iteration of these cards is coming out of Rivals, and it's the card Fight Back. It's gray, it's neutral, so we can play it in a lot more decks than He Doesn't Like You, and its effect is incredibly similar. I remove a die of mine to remove a die of yours, but the die that I remove has to be showing damage, okay? What I would extract from this is that FFG no longer considers removing a die to be worth 1 resource, but perhaps they do, and instead of being gray and neutral, equivalent to 1 resource. Maybe that's why it doesn't cost 0, right? I'm not really sure. But in any case, it once again illustrates the restrictive nature of removal in the set and gives you a little bit of insight into how they value colors and factions and effect all sort of together. And when you look at a card like Fight Back, you're thinking to yourself, well, yeah, I can play it in more decks, and I can still remove any one of my dice, but I have to remove a specific kind of die, and it's also costing me 1 resource. So do they not consider removing a die to replace that 1 resource cost anymore because it's gray? So you've got to think about these sort of back and forth things again that they're doing here, right? And all these restrictions that they've added to removal cards have lowered their power significantly. There are going to be much fewer catch-all removal cards. You know, to look at something like Subjugate, that's what they consider the cost of a card that can remove any die and goes into a villain deck. It's 2 resources right there for complete freedom to keep all of your dice and remove any die you want, right? Costs you 2. And it's really interesting, isn't it? By this time next year, the way things are going, this card might actually be considered great. Scary thought. All right. So there's always going to be cards that come out of a set that become part of shaping a new meta. And that is, of course, as long as the set is worth the paper that it's printed on, and Legacies absolutely is. Because it's a core set, it has to have a solid base for continuing the standard format, as well as being able to sustain itself in establishing a brand new format as a starting point for something like trilogies. So essentially, it's got to be able to do double duty, and Legacies also does that. And what you need to know about the cards that I'm about to show you is that they have a solid power level. Some are even above the curve in a way. And in standard, they bring something to the table never seen before, or that it does better than anything we've had previously. In some cases, the die cards are just good, or they're enabling new or established archetypes already in a way that was really, really needed, right? So they're filling a gap of some kind. And there are a lot of cards that I want to show you. So instead of talking through all of them, I'm going to just put them up here on the screen in a batch, in a slideshow for a few moments instead of going through them all individually, because otherwise we're going to be here for 20, 30 minutes, okay? And I think that the set's been out long enough by now that I think I could probably do that. So let's start that. Alrighty, so there they are. You know, there's only one red card I know, and it was the E11. And, you know, while Tarkin, which you might be thinking about, is really good, he's not shaping the meta right now, unfortunately, not in standard. But in trilogies, he actually is making a bit of a splash, you know, and I think some of that's due to just the sort of the limited availability of characters in the block. But I think he still has a very solid die, and he is going to have a big future in this block, you know. Also, a lot of the red cards kind of got the boot for being overcosted for their effect, or just not being impactful enough, or not being played enough in the meta. You know, my personal favorite is Scorched Earth, because like nobody sees that coming. But again, it's not making a big splash, so it wasn't like you know, I wanted to throw into the presentation or anything like that. But those are all the cards that I feel have making the biggest splash coming into Legacies from Legacies. into standard, into trilogies. If there's any others, feel free to add them in the comments below. Well, folks, this one's in the books. This past month has been really hectic in the world of Destiny. The lead up to Worlds was, full of so much content to consume. And then it actually happened. And then there was so much going on afterwards, and still is. It probably doesn't mean anything coming from me, but congrats to Edwin, Mads, Mike, and Joe from Hyperloops on their finishes. You guys are the best players in the world right now, and you've earned it. You slogged through, and you did an excellent job. Moving forward in the world of content creation on this channel, well, you can expect the usual stuff, although it may be kind of slow over the next month or so. I'm finishing up my certification, and I'll have to sit for a state exam after that. We still have a puppy running around this house, so that's taking up a lot of my time. Naturally, if I had to choose between spending time with my wife and doing this, I'm going to be spending time with her. So, you guys have a lot of competition. I hate to say it, but however, I'm still planning to go to Highlander Games every Wednesday night for league matches and standard play. So if you're in the area, Wednesdays at 7, I will usually get there a little earlier. And you want to catch a game, feel free to hit me up. I have no problem with that. Also, you should know that the channel's expansion, which we talked about, I believe, in mid-April, is currently on hold. My buddy Ken has some unforeseen stuff going on in real life right now that's preventing him from getting online matches in right now. Obviously, that's the same for me. The podcast idea is still in the works, but right now it's a lot to handle as things wind down in school and are picking up at work, and I'm looking to sort of transition jobs as well. The good news, however, is that there's plenty of content out there to watch and listen to, so you'll never be alone. If you like my stuff though and you want to donate to me, hit me up on Patreon at RebelGraySWD, and that will probably keep me going a little while longer. All right, everyone, thanks for watching, and hope to catch you in the next one. Until then, remember that your focus determines your reality. May the Force be with you.